The Cayce life readings that provide detailed reincarnational information for individuals reflect Cayce's psychic process that was highly dependent upon those who sought his services. Thus it is with the reincarnational history of Britain, in which we have very little to consider between the ending of the Crusades in 1291 and the Tudor period that began in 1485. Souls tend to incarnate in groups to work out their lessons together. The soul groups that came to Edgar Cayce for readings are in turn related to his soul group in a broader sense. These interdependent factors result in historical gaps when considered strictly in terms of a chronological timeline. So we will pick up our reincarnational survey of Britain with the Tudor dynasty and the family of Henry VIII. Curiously, Edgar Cayce did not give readings for anyone who had a past life as Henry VIII, but may have identified a late 19th century birth date. In a reading given on August 1, 1925 for a 46-year-old woman, at the beginning of the reading when he counted backward in time to the birth year of the individual getting the reading, he commented, "Henry VIII, August 1st, 1890. Presumably Henry VIII was reincarnated on that date, although no other information was provided or requested for fear of breaking into the scheduled reading. Interestingly, a similar incident occurred a few days before, on July 17, 1925, when Cayce was counting back the years at the beginning of a reading for another individual. Upon reaching the year 1906, he noted, July 21st, 1906, Caesar was born into the world again on this date. Gertrude Cayce, Edgar's wife, was conducting the reading. She asked where was Caesar born. Cayce replied, Bellefontaine, Ohio. As with the reading that mentioned Henry VIII, no further information was requested or provided, so that the scheduled reading could be given. One can only wonder about the nature of Cayce's psychic process when such data seems to bleed through spontaneously. Did the historical fame of Caesar and Henry VIII somehow produce an intrusion into his consciousness? Well, at any rate, even though we don't have a reading for Henry VIII, that soul entity may have been around at the time, but just did not get a life reading from Edgar Cayce. However, there were 4 individuals who did receive life readings, indicating a close association with that famous monarch when he ruled England. A reading given on April 30th, 1943 for a 41-year-old man discussed a past life as a court jester to Henry VIII. The reading indicated that as jester he dealt with all the various activities in which the king was involved, from politics to the welfare of the land. He was described as a front man for the king, serving as a buffer, using humor to settle disputes and iron out differences as they arose. The reading affirmed that he was a helpful force throughout that incarnation and had carried over into his modern life the ability to use wit and humor in his associations and relationships. Unfortunately, the reading did not provide a name for the court jester. Although Henry VIII had several jesters, one might wonder if this individual's past life was as Will Somers, Henry's favorite jester, who not only kept the monarch amused by playing the fool, but was also the king's confidant, spy, and counselor. Certainly Henry needed some levity, for his reign was clouded by some dark episodes, accentuated by beheadings of those that disappointed him. And at the top of that list we find Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. Henry was obsessed with producing a male heir, which stemmed partly from his personal vanity and partly from his belief that a daughter would be too weak to maintain peace and further the Tudor dynasty. When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, disappointed him in her reproductive capacity, he married Anne Boleyn with the expectation of producing just such an heir. Of course, the necessity of an annulment of his first marriage led to the break with the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, leading to the English Reformation. Thus, Henry's relationship with Anne Boleyn had significant historical import, in addition to the drama and intrigue when Anne was beheaded by Henry on trumped-up charges of infidelity, incest, and sexual perversion. From a reincarnational standpoint of soul development, the story of Anne Boleyn has layers of meaning, depending upon how one interprets her motivation and purpose. Was Anne Boleyn an evil master manipulator who seduced a vulnerable king and then betrayed him in the most awful and degrading way imaginable, deserving to have her head severed by the executioner's axe? Or was Anne a simple, virtuous maiden who got caught up in the affairs of court, resisted Henry's repeated advances until finally surrendering her virtue to an egotistical, vain monarch who could not control his passions? And then Henry trumped up charges against his wife, the Queen, to eliminate her so that he could move on to his next conquest and potential mother of a male heir that Anne was unable to produce. What a story, however it is told. Interestingly, a reading given on January 22, 1938 for a one-week-old baby girl may shed some light on this story from a psychic perspective. For this baby was said to have lived as Anne Boleyn. In some of the preface material just before discussing the past lives of the entity, the character of the individual was defined as one that is of a very determined nature, who will often go to extremes and insist on having its own way. Certainly it would take such an individual to go head-to-head with King Henry VIII, and this likely suggests the relationship dynamics that eventually led to the disastrous conclusion of that marriage. The section of the reading that discussed the Anne Boleyn incarnation began by acknowledging the disturbance between church and state associated with that past life. The reading then cut to the heart of the matter with regard to Anne's basic intent and motivation. She failed in her attempt to hold to her religious and moral convictions as she became associated with the material and political affairs of the court of King Henry. The reading acknowledged that it was a complex and intriguing story that can be considered from many angles, as it has been in the centuries since that era. And yet, in summarizing the soul development during the incarnation as Anne Boleyn, the reading simply stated that the entity gained, the entity lost, the entity gained in the experience. This complex character arc suggests that Anne was essentially a good person with good intent, who got caught up in an unfortunate relationship with her king, losing in that relationship, but eventually coming back to her spiritual values and remaining true to herself at the end, through the trial, humiliation, and execution to which she was subjected by Henry. Her reading does contain some additional fascinating information about other past lives that influenced her modern incarnation. Most notably, she was said to have been the prophetess Anna, who prophesied about Jesus in Jerusalem during the presentation of Jesus at the temple when Mary came to be purified. That was a difficult lifetime from a purely materialistic perspective, but rich in soul development in service to others and God. Another significant past life was cited as Hannah, the mother of the Hebrew prophet Samuel. Hannah dedicated her life to spiritual laws and not material things alone. The 20th century parents of the baby who had been Anne Boleyn were cautioned that they would need to provide strong spiritual emphasis and training of the child as she developed to help counteract a strong tendency to materialism. When the question was posed, how is it possible that a soul with past lives so profoundly spiritual as Anna and Hannah could possibly succumb to materialism? Apparently that incarnation as Anne Boleyn in the court of Henry VIII, married to that king with all the wealth and power of a queen, still resonated within the psyche of that baby as the parents sought Edgar Cayce's counsel. Despite Henry's obsession with the male heir, the best that Anne Boleyn could produce was a girl named Elizabeth, and what a woman she grew up to be. A reading given on October 8, 1940 for a 31-year-old woman described a past life as Queen Elizabeth, who made for those activities that were questioned by many, and especially her favors to those of other lands, and yet her reign brought the greater benefit to the subjects of her kingdom. The reading noted that the question of whether her reign was a period of development or retardment can be determined by the reverence with which she is still regarded in England. Thus her reading affirmed that regardless of any questions that may be raised, Queen Elizabeth always administered her royal authority in good conscience with regard to the people of her kingdom, though not necessarily with regard to the land itself. In her modern lifetime, this woman experienced the influences of her royal past life in conflicting ways, both good and bad. Sometimes when interacting with other individuals, she felt inner turmoil, much as she had as Elizabeth. Her reading encouraged her to focus on the same purposes as she had as that famous ruler. This woman asked what color would be most helpful for spiritual aid. She was told that she would vibrate most constructively to that which was the coronet as of Queen Beth's time, which would make her invincible to men and to others, but to wear the color out of sight. That was certainly a familiar expression, Queen Beth, and it was soon repeated when she asked where to learn more about that past life. She also asked about a vision that she sometimes experienced consciously during the daytime, in which she saw a revolving universe studded with stars. She was told that the vision symbolized the power to rule the universe, which she attained as Queen Elizabeth. Interestingly, Edgar Cayce provided some fascinating insights about this woman while in the conscious state. Cayce could see and interpret auras, colorful energy patterns about the physical body. In her case, he described a very good aura, mostly blue with gray light. Rather than long points or just a cloud, her aura was more of a fold, like a turban about the face and shoulders. Cayce interpreted this in psychological terms, as a tendency to be almost sure of yourself and then not sure at all. At times, Queen Elizabeth seemed to have had that characteristic as well. In total, there were 4 readings given for this woman, including an aura chart reading and 2 physical readings. As we near completion of this bit of reincarnational Tudor history, we can also consider a reading given for a 52-year-old widow that described a past life as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth. In that incarnation, she was called Beth Manning and helped to keep a balance in the extremes inherent in the Queen's life. It was a life of wonderment and development as she gained through the experience, in giving and taking counsel to those of both sexes in that social setting. In her modern life, she carried over the ability to be a quick and good judge of human nature, with intuitive feelings toward individuals and groups, whether in the political, social, or economic phases of life. As has been noted, Henry VIII had a preoccupation with having a son, so that the Tudor dynasty would continue. Inasmuch as his granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, never married or produced heirs, we turn now to another chapter in the reincarnational history of Britain, the House of Stuart.